The air at dawn in late February is thin and sharp, every breath tasting faintly of snowmelt and juniper resin. Shadows stretch long and blue across crusted snow, and in those shadows life moves in silence. The land here is honest in its hardships. The wind will cut through wool, the sun will burn in minutes, and water runs where it will, carving into the red earth with no regard for human need. It's a place that rewards patience and punishes those who arrive expecting it to bend. That morning, frost feathered the edges of a half-frozen creek. The sound of water beneath the ice was soft, a muted trickle like a whisper through cupped hands. Along the far bank, moving as if the ground itself had shaped her, padded paws pressed into the thin crust of snow without sound. Sombra, though she would not earn a name until much later, was young for a bobcat, just 2 winters old, her frame compact yet strong, weighing no more than 20 pounds. Tufts of black-tipped fur rose from her ears, catching the pale light, each twitch mapping the world in directions her amber eyes did not need to turn. She was a study in tension and grace. The muscles beneath her spotted coat held both readiness and restraint, each step measured. She was not hunting, she was watching. Her tail tip flicked once, a small tell of thought, before she sank low into the shelter of an overhanging cedar bough. Her kind were solitary by nature, holding territories up to 30 square miles, but there was something different in the way she lingered, as if the open meadow just ahead was a stage she didn't want to cross. The bobcat's wariness was not the jittery fear of an animal unaccustomed to predators. It was deeper, older. She held herself like someone who had learned that attention, once caught, could cost more than it gave. In another life, in another place, her instincts would have been enough to keep her fed and safe. But here, winter stretched its hand into spring and pressed harder than it should, thinning prey and driving deer higher into the mountains. Hunger was a slow ache she did not show, the kind that curled beneath her ribs and whispered of risk. Far above the creek, in a cabin crouched among piñon pines, Daniel Cortez was awake before the light. The habit was left over from years of field expeditions with his late wife, where the best photographs were made in hours when most of the world still slept. His fingers curled around a coffee mug, heat soaking into his palms, but the weight of the ceramic was less comforting than it used to be. The walls around him were pinned with moments, her smile at a camera trap find, the arc of an elk in mid-leap, frost clinging to eyelashes in a sub-zero dawn. Each photo a fragment of a life that had ended too soon. The camera on the table was both a lifeline and a burden. Daniel hadn't picked it up for work in over a year, not since she was gone. He told himself he was taking a break, but in truth, the thought of capturing beauty without her beside him felt like theft. Yet the land outside didn't care for human timelines. Tracks appeared in fresh snow, whether or not you were ready to follow them. It was while pouring the last of his coffee that he saw her. No more than a shadow moving along the far bank of the creek below the cabin's ridge. Too small for a mountain lion, too deliberate for a coyote. His chest tightened with a sudden, involuntary pull. The bobcat moved as though she'd been shaped by the same silence that had wrapped itself around him since the funeral. She stopped, lifting her head, ears swiveling toward a sound he could not hear. The light caught her then, and for the briefest moment, Daniel thought of all the times he'd stood on that same creek bank with his wife, waiting for something wild to appear. Didn't lift the camera, not yet. Some moments weren't meant to be taken, only witnessed. The storm that had threatened for days finally passed in the night, leaving the valley rinsed clean. By morning, the air held that rare stillness that follows rain, a kind of pause in which even the wind seems to rest. A low mist clung to the creek basin, twisting in pale ribbons through the willows. Sunlight, pale at first, caught in droplets hanging from cedar tips and the long, wiry grass, turning each into a bead of fire. From the cabin's porch, Daniel watched as the first true warmth of the day began to touch the land. Winter here did not depart all at once. It retreated in small surrenders, a patch of snow melting into dark soil, a stream that ran clear instead of cloudy with ice melt, a bird returning to its perch after long absence. Somewhere far down slope, a canyon wren sang its descending liquid notes, each one falling into the hush like a pebble dropped into deep water. The creek below had widened with the runoff, its surface broken by drifting ice plates that spun slowly in eddies. The scent of wet earth and juniper resin rose with the warming air, underlined by the faint metallic tang of snowmelt water. Deer tracks, sharp and fresh, cut across the muddy bank where they had come down for a drink before moving on. But no human tracks joined them. Not here, not now. This was country that kept its own company. On the far bank, Sombra emerged from the cover of a fallen cottonwood, her fur darker with damp, paws leaving soft impressions in the thawing ground. She moved along the water's edge with the casual grace of one who knew every bend and hollow, yet her pace was slow, her head lifting often to taste the air. Bobcats hunted mostly in the blue hours of dawn and dusk, relying on their keen hearing and vision to catch the faint rustle of small prey. This morning, though, her attention seemed elsewhere, drawn to the sounds beyond the normal litany of creek and wind. She paused at a stand of willows, their young shoots already pushing tentative green. The bobcat's tail tip flicked once before she stepped onto a flat rock, settling into a half crouch. Her ears, lined with fine hairs that filtered sound, swiveled toward the slope where the cabin stood hidden behind the rise. Daniel knew she could not see him from here. The angle and distance would keep him hidden. But still, she seemed aware of something. Not alarmed, not yet, but present in that animal way, measuring the edges of her world for change. The sun broke fully over the ridge then, pouring molten light across the meadow and throwing the bobcat's shadow long behind her. Steam began to lift from her coat, curling in faint tendrils into the warming air. She blinked slowly, the movement unhurried, and in that moment, the land itself seemed to exhale. For Daniel, the scene held a quiet magnetism. This was the kind of morning he used to live for, the kind where light, air, and life all conspired to create something wordless yet undeniable. Before, he would have been crouched in the brush with his wife, cameras ready, trading silent signals. Now he simply watched, his coffee cooling beside him, unwilling to break the fragile perfection by reaching for the lens. The Sangre de Cristo Range had always been their shared ground. Here, pinyon jays moved in noisy flocks, mule deer grazed in the dawn light, and the rare mountain lion left its signature in the snow on high passes. But bobcats were more elusive. Solitary, territorial, and naturally shy of human activity, they slipped through the folds of the land like smoke. Seeing one at all was a rare gift. Seeing one linger in the open was rarer still. The air warmed another degree, and a drift of scent carried from the meadow to the porch. The faint musk of wild fir mingled with the damp sweetness of early willow buds. Daniel leaned against the railing, letting the boards take his weight, and let the image of her fix in his mind. She was smaller than he would have imagined, but there was a density to her presence, a deliberate completeness in the way she occupied each moment. Beyond her, the meadow sloped toward the thicker timber that guarded the foothills. A red-tailed hawk wheeled above, its shadow sliding over her without drawing a flinch. She had chosen her place well, near water, with cover on three sides and open ground to see trouble coming. Somewhere in the stillness, a kinship took root. She belonged entirely to herself, yet she was here, in view, as the land softened under the first signs of spring. Daniel knew enough to understand that such moments didn't wait for you. They happened once, and only once, in exactly this way. And in that knowledge, he stayed still, letting the morning deepen around them both. From her perch on the flat rock, Sombra became less a figure in the landscape and more the landscape itself. The curve of her spine followed the line of the rock slope, the muted tans and russets of her coat blending seamlessly with the willow shadows. If not for the occasional flick of an ear or the steady rise and fall of her breath, she might have been mistaken for a part of the earth. Her eyes, amber flecked with gold, held the kind of focus that belonged to creatures who survived by noticing everything. They scanned the meadow, not with the restless darting of prey animals, but with deliberate sweeps, as if she could weigh the worth of every sound before deciding to respond. Somewhere in the underbrush, a vole shifted, so soft that even Daniel, standing in the cabin's shadow, could barely hear it, but her ears tracked it instantly. She didn't move toward it, not yet. Bobcats were ambush predators, relying on patience over pursuit. They could leap 10 feet in a single bound, their hind legs coiled like springs under the thick winter fur. In summer, Sombra's coat shed into a shorter, sleeker layer, but now it was still dense from the cold months, each hair insulating her from the chill ground beneath her. Her whiskers quivered slightly, reading air currents the way a mariner reads the wind. Daniel felt the strange pull of wanting to assign her thoughts, to imagine what she was feeling, but he also knew enough to respect the truth of her instincts. Whatever passed behind those eyes was hers alone, shaped by winters survived and narrow escapes no human had witnessed. Still, there was something in her posture, the way she kept her body low yet not fully tensed, the way her gaze lingered more often on the tree line than the meadow, that hinted at more than simple hunting strategy. When she finally moved, it was with a grace that made the act seem inevitable. Her paws touched the ground with a kind of reverence, spreading her weight so evenly that the damp grass hardly bent beneath her. She threaded through the willows, pausing once to rub her cheek against a low branch. The action left behind a scent marker from the glands near her mouth, a quiet declaration that this was her space. In that moment, Daniel's mind traced back to a lecture his wife once gave at a community nature event. She'd explained how bobcats use these scent marks not only to warn rivals, but to reassure themselves. The land changed with each season, with every storm that bent the trees and shifted the rocks. Leaving a marker was a way of saying, "I was here. I belong here." It was both a claim and a comfort. The knowledge stirred something in him. He'd been living in the cabin alone for over a year now, keeping the place almost exactly as it had been when she was alive. The same mugs on the same shelf, her hiking boots by the door, though no one wore them. It was, he realized, his own form of scent marking, a way of holding on to what felt safe. Sombra slipped back toward the creek, her movements slow enough to suggest she wasn't in any rush to leave. She stopped at the water's edge, lowering her head to drink. Her pink tongue flicked against the surface, catching both water and melting slush. A bead clung to her chin before dropping back into the current. She drank in small, measured pulls, lifting her head every few seconds to scan the meadow again. Daniel found himself mirroring her pauses, glancing around the way she did, listening for something beyond the usual morning chorus. There was no immediate threat. No scent of coyote on the wind, no hawk shadow wheeling low. Yet her vigilance never fully eased. That, he understood, was the life of a wild creature. Even in peace, there was no total rest. When she finished, she didn't shake the water from her whiskers. Instead, she stepped onto a narrow gravel bar where the creek bent toward the timber. The sun was higher now, warm enough to draw steam from the rocks. She settled there, curling her tail around her paws, eyes half closed. This, Daniel thought, was as close to relaxation as she would allow herself in daylight. The smell of wet stone and early willow sap drifted up to the porch. He leaned forward on the railing, knowing that any sudden movement would break the spell. From here, he could see the subtle rise and fall of her breath, the faint pulse in her throat. Every line of her was built for survival, yet in this stillness there was an elegance untouched by necessity. For a while, neither of them moved. The creek whispered around its bends, and the sun shifted just enough to light the fine hairs along her cheek. It was the kind of moment that could vanish without warning, but for now it held. Fragile, unclaimed, and entirely theirs. By the next morning, the sky had lowered into a hard, flat gray, the kind that pressed the horizon down until even. The mountains looked smaller. The wind had shifted from the west, carrying with it the thin, metallic scent of snow yet to fall. Daniel stood at the cabin window, coffee warming his hands, and scanned the far bank of the creek out of habit. He hadn't expected to see her so soon again. Creatures like Sombra were masters of vanishing. Yet there she was, emerging from behind a curtain of rabbit brush. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Her gait was the same measured rhythm, her head lifting and lowering in time with the terrain. But then his eyes caught a subtle hitch in her stride. On her right foreleg, the paw landed more cautiously, toes spreading wide to distribute the weight, as if pressing too hard would send a jolt of pain up through the limb. She paused in a shallow depression near the creek, a spot where snowmelt had soaked the ground into a black, sucking mud. The wind lifted the fur along her back in small ripples, revealing the truth that her winter coat could no longer fully hide. The ridges of her ribs, sharper now than they had been days before. Bobcats were opportunistic hunters, able to survive on anything from rabbits to small rodents, even insects if necessary. But in late winter, prey was scarce. Rodent caches were buried deep under crusted snow, and the jackrabbits had thinned their foraging to the higher ground. A limp, even a minor one, meant she would have to work harder to close the final distance on any prey she could find. And each failed attempt would cost her more of the precious energy she couldn't afford to waste. She lowered herself onto her haunches, lifting the injured paw slightly off the ground. It was a small thing, an adjustment for comfort, but Daniel saw the way she shifted her weight, the way her breath deepened after the simple act of sitting. Even from this distance he recognized the signs, not of imminent collapse, but if an animal calculating how much it could bear before the risk outweighed the gain. A gust of wind swept down the valley, ruffling her ear tufts. She didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed, ears angling toward the sound of something hidden in the grass ahead. For a long moment she seemed ready to spring, her hindquarters gathering under her. Then, just as quickly, she eased back, letting the moment pass. Whatever was there, vole, mouse, perhaps a ground squirrel, it wasn't worth the effort today. Daniel's mind drifted to the physiological toll of injury in the wild. His wife used to say that for predators, pain wasn't just discomfort. It was an equation. Every movement had to justify its energy cost. Every decision weighed against the razor edge of survival. The body diverted resources to healing, leaving less for the hunt, for warmth, for everything else. And the more cautious an animal became, the more its opportunities narrowed. A magpie landed nearby, its black and white plumage stark against the brown meadow. It hopped twice toward her, emboldened by her stillness, and called out in its harsh, metallic voice. Sombra turned her head slowly, meeting its eye. She didn't lunge. She didn't even bare her teeth. The bird, perhaps sensing the limits of her interest, took wing again, leaving a faint echo of wing beats in the cold air. Snow began to fall then, slow, deliberate flakes that twisted in the wind before settling on her fur. She blinked them away, without shaking herself, conserving even that small motion. The sound of the creek was muted under the soft hiss of snowfall, and for a while the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. Daniel knew enough about wild animals to keep his distance. Intervention wasn't as simple as stepping in to help. To approach now would risk driving her farther from a known water source, farther from familiar hunting grounds, and into deeper snow where her limp could become a death sentence. Yet watching her there, motionless except for the rise and fall of her breath, stirred a quiet ache in him. She rose again after a time, careful on the injured paw, and moved upstream toward the shelter of thicker trees. The snow followed her, erasing her tracks almost as soon as she made them. Daniel stayed at the window long after she vanished, staring at the place where she'd stood, the imprint of her quiet endurance lingering like the last scent of rain in the air. Daniel had not planned to spend the winter here. When his wife, Elena, died the previous February, the cabin had become both too full and too empty. Every surface carried her imprint, the field guides stacked by the wood stove, the worn parka still hanging from the peg near the door, the mugs with faint rings from mornings they'd spent on the porch together. Yet the silence inside felt nothing like peace. It was a silence that pressed inward, pressing his chest against his spine, making him small in his own home. He'd retreated here telling himself it was temporary, a season to get his bearings. Friends in Santa Fe had offered spare rooms, but the thought of being watched, of people trying to gauge his grief by how much coffee he drank or whether he slept, was unbearable. Here, in the foothills, no one asked. The land did not require explanations. It only asked that you pay attention. Daniel had built a modest career as a wildlife photographer, though he'd always credited Elena as the one with the real patience for the work. She'd been a conservation biologist with a specialty in felids, equally at home in a lab or tracking a collar signal through dense juniper scrub. He had learned to love the slow rhythm of her field days, the way she'd stop mid-step to listen for an unseen bird, the way she read tracks in snow as though the animal had written a letter just for her. They'd met in the Pecos wilderness years before marriage, when he was on assignment to document migratory birds and she was collaring bobcats for a population study. He'd been struck not by her beauty, though it was there in abundance, but by her stillness. She didn't fill silences with words. She inhabited them, like water filling a hollow in stone. Her death had come without warning, a sudden illness that even the best specialists could not slow. In the months afterward, Daniel found himself unable to lift his camera. Every frame seemed like an accusation. Why are you here to see this and she is not? And yet, when he first glimpsed the bobcat on the creek bank days ago, something in him shifted. It wasn't that she reminded him of Elena exactly. It was that the sight of her, taut with awareness, self-contained, carried the same gravity. Sombra's world was pared down to essentials: shelter, water, the careful calculus of risk. His had narrowed too, though by choice or necessity he couldn't say. The locals in the nearest town, 20 miles downslope, knew him as the quiet man who came in for supplies twice a month. He spoke enough Spanish to trade weather observations with the cashier, enough English to discuss the road conditions with the old rancher who lingered by the feed store's wood stove, but he never stayed long. He kept to the edges of their community like a deer keeping to the edge of a clearing. It was through one of those brief conversations that he'd met Anna Lucero, a retired wildlife rehabilitator who now raised chickens and kept a vet kit in the back of her truck for emergencies. She had a blunt way of speaking, a habit born of years coaxing injured animals back to health. Once, over a bag of cornmeal at the general store, she'd told him, "Helping is easy, knowing when not to help is the real work." Those words returned to him now as he thought of out the limp in Sombra's step. He could call Anna, tell her what he'd seen, but he already knew her answer. As long as the animal was mobile and in familiar territory, it was better to let her be. Human interference, however well-meaning, could shatter the fragile pattern of a wild life. Still, Daniel found himself watching for her each morning, his coffee growing cold while his eyes traced the far bank. He told himself it was curiosity, a professional's interest in observing an elusive predator, but there was more under it, the pull of recognition, the comfort of seeing another living thing moving through the same sparse terrain he now inhabited. On mornings when she didn't appear, he'd walk the ridgeline above the creek, scanning for fresh tracks. The snow told stories in delicate relief, the straight-line print of a fox, the deep paired marks of a mule deer, the faint rounded impressions of her paws when she passed this way. He never followed them far. She had her roots, and he had learned to honor their distance. The foothills in late winter were a patchwork of endurance. Pinon and juniper clung to shallow soil, roots gripping the rock. Ravens floated above the thermals, their wings tilting to invisible currents. Even the light seemed patient, stretching thin over the land, waiting for spring to push the shadows back. In that patience, Daniel felt a kind of kinship, not just with the land, but with the wary, amber-eyed cat who moved through it like a ghost he was slowly beginning to see. The morning broke clear and cold, the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry farther than it should. Frost glazed the meadow grasses, their brittle stalks catching the first gold of the sun. The creek, no longer hidden beneath ice, ran quick and narrow in its channel, its voice brighter than it had been in weeks. Daniel had been outside since before dawn, standing on the porch, with his jacket zipped high and the camera resting against his chest. He hadn't come to take pictures, not yet, but to listen. The foothills had a way of announcing change if you stood still long enough. A sudden absence of bird calls, the muffled rhythm of hooves in snow, the ripple of willows when nothing visible passed through. It was the stillness that made him look toward the far bank. The world there seemed to pause. No magpies, no rabbits visible between the sage. Then, with a shift so subtle it could have been a trick of light, Sombra appeared at the edge of the willows. Her coat was dry now, the damp weather heaviness gone, and the morning sun deepened the reddish cast along her flanks. She moved in that unhurried way of hers, each step deliberate, paws landing without sound. The limp was still there, faint but present, making her front right paw touch down softer than the rest. She paused by a fallen log, nose testing the air. Daniel stayed perfectly still, every muscle tuned to the space between them. From this angle she could not yet see the cabin directly, but she was close enough that he could trace the dark markings on her legs, faint bars like shadows of tall grass. Her ears pivoted once, twice, before settling toward the slope where he stood. He imagined she could hear the shift of his weight on the porch boards, the faint creak of wood beneath him, even through the cold air. For a long moment they regarded each other without sight, connected only by the invisible line of awareness. Daniel felt the question in the air, predator or threat, witness or intruder. He didn't lift the camera. He didn't move at all. Sombra stepped into the open then, her body outlined against the pale curve of the creek. The wind turned, carrying her scent, faint, musky, edged with the clean smell of frost, up the slope. Daniel's pulse caught, not from fear, but from the sharp intimacy of it. For wild animals, scent was biography. In that instant, she had given him a piece of herself without me, unning too. She stopped mid-step, head lifting slightly, and turned her gaze toward the porch. Even at this distance, the gold of her eyes caught the light. She didn't flinch, didn't startle, but her muscles gathered under her as if ready to bolt if he crossed the line between stillness and approach. The space between them was measured not in yards, but in choice, hers, not his. Daniel had watched enough wildlife to know that trust, if it came at all, had to be earned by doing less, not more. So he let the moment stretch, let her decide whether this morning was for watching or retreating. She resumed her slow path along the bank, never turning fully away from him. At the narrowest bend, where the creek's current brushed against the roots of a leaning cottonwood, she paused again. A shaft of light cut through the branches, landing across her shoulders like a pale mantle. The fur along her spine shifted as she breathed, and Daniel thought of Elena's words from years ago. Some animals carry their history in their posture. You just have to learn the language. Sombra lowered her head to drink, ripples fanning out from her muzzle. Each swallow was measured, interrupted by brief lifts of her head to check the meadow, the slope, him. There was no urgency in her movements, but neither was there ease. When she finally moved on, she followed the creek upstream, slipping back into the shadows of the willows. Daniel let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The boards beneath his feet were warm now from the sun, but he didn't go inside. He stayed, eyes fixed on the place where she'd disappeared, the faintest trace of her scent still in the air, proof that for a few quiet minutes they had shared the same morning. The next meeting came on a morning thick with fog, the kind that softened edges and made distance impossible to measure. The valley below was swallowed in, a pale, shifting veil. Only the nearest cottonwoods showed their full shape, their trunks black with moisture. The air tasted of wet stone and last night's rain, and the creek's voice was louder than usual, its surface catching stray droplets falling from the trees. Daniel stood halfway down the slope, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He hadn't planned to close the gap between the cabin and the water, but the fog offered a kind of cover, a shared blindness. He moved quietly, feeling the muffled crunch of wet leaves underfoot, until he reached the edge of the meadow. She was already there. Sombra emerged from the mist like a fragment of the land being returned to him. First the ear tufts, then the arc of her back, then her full form. Her coat carried beads of water that glinted faintly even in the muted light, and her whiskers trembled as she took in the scents layered in the air. The limp was almost invisible now, just the slightest hesitation before her injured paw touched the ground. She moved with that same economy of effort, pausing every few steps to listen. When her gaze swept the meadow, it caught him, not in surprise, but in the same way one might note the position of a familiar tree or stone. For a moment neither of them moved. The fog wrapped around them, dampening the outside world until there was only this shared space. Daniel's breath came slow and quiet, the cold air filling his chest. His fingers itched toward the camera slung at his side, but he resisted. Photographs could wait. Moments like this could not. Sombra took a step toward him, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to mark a choice. Her paws pressed into the soft ground without sound, each movement deliberate. When she stopped again, she held his gaze, eyes half narrowed, not in suspicion, but in a kind of measured acceptance. Daniel felt it like a shift in the air, the moment when awareness became acknowledgement. He had been part of her landscape for days now, a fixture on the far slope or the porch. But this was different. This was her deciding that his presence required neither avoidance nor confrontation. In her world, trust wasn't a declaration. It was the absence of retreat. A breeze lifted then, cool and damp, stirring the grasses between them. It carried his scent to her, and she didn't turn away. Her ears twitched, tracking the faint drip of water from a nearby branch, but her eyes returned to him almost immediately. Daniel thought of the first time he'd stood this close to a bobcat, years ago with Elena. That animal had been collared, part of a research study, and it had regarded them with the wariness of one who understood humans only as captors. Sombra was different, untethered, unmarked, shaped only by the land and her own choices. To stand in her sight now felt less like an achievement and more like an invitation into a story already in progress. She lowered herself into a crouch, not in preparation to pounce, but to rest. Her tail curved neatly around her paws, and the fog beaded along its length. The creek murmured behind her, and for a while they simply shared the sound. Daniel felt the damp seep through his jeans where his knee brushed the grass, but he didn't shift. A raven called from somewhere above, its voice muffled by the fog, and Sombra's head turned briefly toward it. When she looked back at him, there was no flinch, no reassessment, only continuity. The thread between them held. Eventually, she rose and moved on, slipping back into the mist in the direction of the willows. Her form dissolved slowly until only the memory of her shape remained against the white. Daniel stayed where he was long after she'd gone, the scent of wet earth in his lungs, and the quiet certainty that something had changed between them. Not loudly, not in any way the world would notice, but in the way that mattered most. The change in the weather came overnight. A low-pressure system pushed in from the west, heavy with moisture, and by dawn the valley lay beneath a sky the color of old slate. The air was raw and unsettled, carrying the bite of snow yet to come. Daniel woke to the sound of the wind rattling the cabin's shutters and the faint, metallic ring of sleet against the porch roof. It was the kind of day when most animals found shelter and waited it out. But he saw her anyway. Sombra appeared mid-morning, moving along the far bank with her body low to the ground, the limp in her foreleg more pronounced again. It wasn't severe enough to slow her completely, but it made her path deliberate, careful in a way that spoke of conserving energy. Her coat was fluffed against the cold, the pale undersides of her paws flashing briefly with each step. Daniel set his mug down, unease knotting in his stomach. The Bobcat was leaner now than she had been even a week before. The ridge of her spine was more defined beneath the winter fur, and the hollow at her flanks told him she wasn't catching enough to eat. He thought about the weeks ahead. Late winter was always the hardest stretch. Prey populations were at their thinnest, the easy game already taken, and every failed hunt meant another day's energy spent without return. He could do nothing. That was the cleanest choice, the one that kept her wild and untouched by human hand. But the image of her, limping through a storm with an empty belly, pressed hard against the part of him that still remembered what it was like to watch someone you love diminish. Anna's voice came back to him, sharp as the wind outside. Knowing when not to help is the real work. He respected her wisdom, but he also knew she hadn't seen Sombra the way he had, hadn't stood in the fog and felt the unspoken recognition pass between them. That moment had bound them in a way that made doing nothing feel less like respect and more like abandonment. He sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, sketching the shape of a plan. Nothing that would force contact. She'd never allow it, and he wouldn't betray the trust she'd given, but something that might give her a chance to rest without the constant hunger pressing at her. He thought of the venison in the freezer, left over from a neighbor's successful hunt, and the small patch of clearing upstream where the creek bent sharply, offering natural cover on three sides. If he left food there, away from the cabin but within her range, she might take it without connecting it directly to him. Still, it was a gamble. Food left out could attract coyotes or other scavengers, drawing danger closer to her territory. The scent might bring her into conflict with a larger predator. And even if she did find it, there was no guarantee she'd accept it. Wild animals often avoided unfamiliar food. The wind picked up, rattling the stovepipe, and Daniel pulled on his coat. The weight of the decision sat heavy in his chest. It wasn't about saving her, it was about giving her one more choice than the winter was currently offering. He took the venison from the freezer and cut it into smaller pieces, wrapping them in parchment to keep the scent concentrated. Outside, the sleet had thickened to wet snow, clinging to the branches of the junipers and making the air taste faintly metallic. He followed the ridgeline north until he reached the bend in the creek he'd marked in his mind. The ground there was trampled with deer sign. The mud churned from their hooves. Daniel crouched low, placing the wrapped meat in the partial shelter of a fallen log, tucking it far enough inside that it wouldn't be immediately visible from a distance. He brushed his gloves across the snow to break up his tracks on the approach, then stepped back into the trees. For a long while he stayed there, hidden among the piñón, watching the clearing. Snow whispered down through the branches, and the creek's voice was steady. Beneath it, no movement came, no flash of tawny fur against the white. Eventually, he turned back toward the cabin, the cold biting through his coat. Whether she found it or not, the choice had been made. He had crossed the line between observer and participant, not with his hands, but with his intention. And in the quiet of the storm, he knew there was no going back to the distance that had existed before. The snow that had begun as a fine, wet dust the day before deepened overnight into a thick, insulating layer. By morning, the valley was muffled under nearly a foot of white, the air holding that peculiar suspended hush that comes after heavy snowfall. The sky was a washed-out silver, bright but without warmth, and the wind had stilled entirely. Every branch bore the weight of the night's accumulation, bending slightly under its burden. Daniel stepped onto the porch with his breath rising in clouds. He scanned the bend in the creek, though from this distance he couldn't tell if the venison had been disturbed. The snow had reset the landscape, smoothing every track and sign into a clean, unreadable surface. For a moment he wondered if she'd come at all, or if his offering had gone unnoticed beneath the storm's fresh layer. He followed the ridge trail slowly, boots punching into the crusted snow, each step releasing the faint scent of crushed pinon needles. The creek's current was muted under thin ice shelves, its sound a low, continuous hum. As he neared the bend, he paused, crouching low to study the ground. The snow there was no longer pristine. Faint, round impressions marked the approach from the direction of the willows, each print clear enough to show the padded shape of a bobcat's foot. The prints led directly to the fallen log. The snow immediately around it was churned and scattered, as if she'd paced a few times before committing. The parchment wrappings lay torn, edges stiff with frost, and only a few scraps of meat remained, half buried in the snow. She had found it, and she had eaten, Daniel felt. The tension in his shoulders eased, but it was tempered by a new awareness, that his presence here was not as invisible as he liked to think. She would have smelled him on the meat, on the disturbed snow. She might connect that scent with the cabin on the ridge. It was a risk, but a calculated one, and now the decision was out of his hands. He stepped back into the trees, careful to follow his own inbound tracks to avoid making new disturbances. As he turned toward the cabin, movement caught his eye, a flicker of pale fur against the dark trunks upstream. Sombra emerged from the cover of the willows, her coat thick with clinging snow, each step deliberate in the deep drifts. She moved with more energy than he'd expected, though the limp was still faintly there. Her head lifted briefly, nose testing the air, before she crossed the narrowest part of the creek in a single bound, her hindquarters bunching and releasing with fluid precision. Daniel froze where he stood, half hidden by the pinon. She landed lightly on the bank, shook herself once, and continued toward the log. Finding it empty, she lingered a moment, pawing at the snow where the scent remained. Then, without hurry, she circled the area, sniffing the air in slow arcs. When her head turned toward the trees, Daniel knew she'd caught his scent. She didn't bolt. Instead, she stood still, her ears swiveling forward, tail low but not tucked. The moment held a balance, her deciding whether he was a threat worth leaving for or a presence she could ignore. He remained motionless, his breath shallow, every muscle attuned to her choice. After what felt like a long minute, she resumed her path, slipping back into the willows, her tracks weaving between the trunks until the snow swallowed her entirely. Back at the cabin, Daniel set his gloves on the stove to dry and sat for a long time without moving, staring at the steam rising from them. The distance between them was still there, but thinner now, worn down not by intrusion but by repetition. He wasn't just part of the background anymore. He was becoming a variable in her winter, one she was learning to account for and perhaps, in her own cautious way, to allow. The days that followed settled into a rhythm shaped by snowmelt and slow, deliberate visits. Each morning, Daniel would scan the far bank for any sign of her, sometimes finding only unbroken snow, other times catching the faintest movement in the willows. When she did appear, it was never hurried, never reckless. Her approach was the careful threading of a life that had been measured in risks for as long as it had existed. The limp in her foreleg began to fade, though it never vanished entirely. Daniel could see it most on uneven ground, the way her paw touched down just a heartbeat later than the others, as if she were testing the earth, before committing her weight. Yet her movements had more strength now, her body carrying a fullness that had been missing in the leanest days of winter. The meat he left was never left out in the open anymore. He learned to tuck it into natural cover, places she could find without drawing attention from the coyote pair that sometimes skirted the meadow. One morning, a pale light broke over the ridge, spilling gold across the snow. Daniel spotted her crouched on the edge of the creek, hindquarters tensed. A sudden pounce sent her front paws plunging into the snowbank, and she emerged with a vole clamped delicately between her teeth. She carried it to a low rise and ate quickly, every so often lifting her head to check the horizon. The sight eased something in him, not because she'd caught food on her own, but because it reminded him she still could. Bobcats were resilient predators, adapted to survive the harshness of shifting seasons. He'd read about their remarkable musculature, how their hind legs were longer than their front, designed for explosive leaps. Watching her hunt was to see that design in action, her body a blend of calculation and instinct honed over generations. Yet Daniel couldn't help but wonder if her recovery had been helped along by the quiet safety of knowing she could find food without chasing it. Spring's edge began to press into the foothills. The snowpack retreated from the sun-warmed slopes first, revealing mats of last summer's grass, flattened under the weight of months. The air lost its metallic winter bite, replacing it with the resin sweetness of warming pinyon sap. Small birds returned, filling the mornings with bright bursts of sound. It was in this gradual turning that Sombra began to linger longer in the open, sometimes curling herself into the lee of a boulder where the wind couldn't reach her. Daniel never closed the distance between. In them, even on the days when the pull to step closer was strong, he held himself to the same boundaries they'd kept from the start. He remembered Elena's voice, the patient cadence she used when teaching field students, explaining that the truest bond with a wild animal was the one where both walked away still belonging entirely to themselves. Once during a late afternoon he found her stretched out along the top of a low rock ledge, eyes half closed. The light caught in the guard hairs along her spine, turning them into fine filaments of gold. She watched him approach the far edge of the meadow, not with suspicion, but with that slow, unblinking awareness he'd come to recognize. When a gust of wind carried his scent toward her, her ears flicked once, and then she laid her head down again. That evening, as the light faded and the first stars appeared above the ridge, Daniel sat on the porch with his camera beside him, unused. He realized he no longer felt the urgency to capture her on film. The living presence of her, the quiet resilience, the measured acceptance, was worth more than any image he could take. The sound of the creek rose with the meltwater in the coming days, its current a constant undercurrent to their shared space. Each sighting of her now felt less like an accident and more like an agreed-upon meeting, even if neither of them had set the terms. And as the valley moved toward the green of spring, Daniel understood that the healing happening here was not hers alone. By late April, the foothills had shed their winter skin. Snowmelt carved silver threads through the meadows, pooling in low places where willows were already flushing green. The air carried the hum of waking insects, and the light no longer slid across the land at a slant. It poured straight down, warm and unhesitating. Sombra's coat had changed too. The dense winter fur had thinned, revealing the sleeker muscle beneath, her markings sharper against the tawny base. The limp that had once marked her every step was now so faint Daniel had to watch closely to catch it, a ghost of an injury more than a limitation. She moved differently now, not with the guarded economy of winter, but with a quiet confidence that came from knowing she could move, leap, and hunt without the constant weight of pain. One morning, Daniel watched from the slope above the creek as she patrolled the meadow's edge. A mule deer doe, grazing at the far side, lifted her head briefly at Sombra's approach, then returned to cropping the new grass. That casual dismissal spoke volumes. In the shared language of wild things, the doe had read her not as a threat in that moment, but as another piece of the land's rhythm. Daniel felt the change in himself too, though it had been slower to name. The days no longer blurred together as they had in the months after Elena's death. The small rituals of observation, checking the creek at dawn, reading the story of fresh tracks in mud, noting where the willow's buds had opened overnight, had drawn him back into a world that moved whether he marked it or not. He had started taking photographs again, but not of her. The camera turned instead toward the season's subtler offerings, the pale, fleeting blooms of cliff rose, the rough geometry of lichen on granite, the mirrored sky in a shallow melt pool. It wasn't that he didn't want her image, it was that she had become more than a subject. To photograph her now felt like trying to frame something that didn't belong inside a frame at all. One afternoon, the kind that feels longer than the hours it holds, Sombra appeared on the ridge above the cabin. She stood outlined against the sky, the breeze ruffling the fur along her neck. Daniel was in the yard, repairing a length of fence, and he paused mid-swing of the hammer. She was close enough that he could see her whiskers moving in the wind, close enough that the sunlight caught in her eyes. She didn't startle at the sound of the hammer set gently aside. Instead, she descended the ridge in an easy trot, circling wide to avoid the direct line to him, and crossed the slope to the willows by the creek. There she paused and glanced back, not in the skittish, head-snapping way of a hunted animal, but with a steadiness that acknowledged his place in her map of the world. For Daniel, it was as if she had folded him into the landscape the way he had been folded into hers. He was no longer just the man on the porch, the distant figure by the cabin. He was a fixed point in her territory, one she did not need to avoid. The weather turned warm enough for nights on the porch without a coat. He would sit there after sunset, the air carrying the mingled scents of wet earth and warming pine, listening to the night sounds rise. The first frogs, the distant yip of coyotes, the low gurgle of the creek. Sometimes in those hours a shadow would pass at the edge of the meadow, silent and certain. She never approached closer, but she didn't vanish into the trees as quickly anymore. It struck him then. The arc of these months had not been about rescue in the way people like to tell it. Neither of them had been saved. They had instead walked the long, quiet path back toward themselves side by side in a way that did not require touching. And in that shared recovery, Daniel understood something Elena had tried to teach him years ago, that presence, offered without demand, can be its own kind of transformation. The last time Daniel saw her, the meadow was awash in the pale light of early summer. The creek had shrunk to a quick, narrow thread, its banks lined with tall grasses that swayed in the warm wind. Wildflowers freckled the slopes, yellow blanket flower, purple lupine, the last white bursts of cliff rose, and the air was thick with the hum of bees. Sombra appeared at 2. He tree-lined just after dawn, her coat sleek and burnished from the season's abundance. She paused in the shadows, nose lifting to test the wind, then stepped into the open without hesitation. The strength in her stride was undeniable now, no trace of the limp, her muscles rippling in smooth, effortless rhythm. She moved with the ease of a creature unburdened, wholly at home in her own skin. Daniel watched from the porch, the mug in his hands forgotten as she followed the familiar curve of the creek. She didn't stop at the bend where he'd once left food. She didn't glance toward the cabin. Her path was deliberate, angled toward the higher ridges where the timber deepened and the air thinned. When she reached the far edge of the meadow, she paused. The light caught her in profile, the fine hairs along her ear tufts glowing like threads of copper. For a moment she looked back, not long enough to read as farewell, but long enough to mark the space they had shared. Then she turned and slipped into the trees, her shape dissolving into the green and shadow until there was nothing left but the sound of wind moving through the leaves. Daniel stayed where he was, the silence folding in around him. There was no ache in watching her go, only a quiet fullness, as if the months of shared mornings and unspoken recognition had planted something in him that would keep growing long after she was gone. The cabin didn't feel as hollow as it had in those first months without Elena. The land felt less like a refuge from the world and more like part of the world again. He thought about the choices he'd made, the times he'd stepped forward, the times he'd held back. about the way trust had been built between them, not in grand gestures, but in the steady accumulation of moments where neither turned away. And he realized that, in her way, Sombra had reminded him of a truth he'd known on but had forgotten. That connection doesn't have to be loud to be real, and love doesn't have to hold on to be lasting. As the sun climbed, light spilled over the meadow, gilding the grass and the slow-moving water. Somewhere in the ridges, she was hunting, resting, patrolling her range, living the life she was meant to live. Daniel lifted his mug again, the steam curling into the warm air, and felt the rare kind of peace that comes not from having, but from having been there. If you've ever experienced a moment of perfect understanding with an animal, subscribe now to join others who believe connection transcends words. Tell me in the comments, what's the most profound moment you've shared with an animal?